Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Brockhampton, Roadrunner, New Light, New Machine. This was a record that I was looking forward to quite a bit, considering that I was a pretty big fan of all the previous releases from these guys, and not only that, but because this has been the longest length of time between studio albums for these guys. Their last studio album, Ginger, came out back in August of 2019, and while they did drop some loose singles last year, I was just really interested to see if the sound of this project was going to be similar to those singles or something a little bit different. Yeah, I was just really excited to see what direction this was going to be going in. Overall, I think Roadrunner is another very solid addition to this group's discography. I think it's probably my least favorite Brockhampton studio album so far, but even still, I find it one that's really enjoyable. The sound of this thing is one that's mostly rap focused. It moves away quite a bit from the warmer, more mellow tone that was on most of Ginger, and instead it does at points feel very reminiscent of some of those more rap driven songs that the group dropped as loose tracks last summer and spring, but all the songs on this album do feel a bit more developed and polished compared to a lot of those tracks. And I think the tone of this thing is one that's very colorful, very vibrant, all over the place. At points, it does feel kind of reminiscent of the very colorful feel of the Saturation trilogy in some regards, but only in the case of this project. The sounds that the band is playing with are a little bit different, and it ends up making a project that does ultimately sound different from any of those three releases. You know, while most of the songs on this thing are rap tracks, you do have some tracks on this thing that are a bit more pop driven, a bit more R&B driven, some other weird experimental moments on this thing that just do something a little bit different compared to anything Brockhampton has done before. But overall, the group is able to pull off all these ideas, and they're able to produce a very cohesive album as well, thanks to the sequencing here and the track list for the most part, as well as the themes here on this record. The themes here on Roadrunner are probably the aspect of this project that keeps this thing feeling as focused as it does throughout its runtime, despite all the various sounds present here on this thing. And it's mostly because Roadrunner is a concept record that really focuses on the recent suicide of group member Joba's father last year. And of course, that's something very deep and personal to him. And I really like how the group formats the discussion of this topic here on this project. Of course, there's many members of the group, and oftentimes on previous Brockhampton releases, they've tried to, I guess, divide up all the runtime on the record somewhat evenly between all of the members. But here on Roadrunner, it's a little bit different. They do give Joba a bit more time here on this record to do his thing. It's a bit more noticeable that he has a bit more time to himself to express his thoughts here on this project. And while on a typical Brockhampton release in the past, that might seem kind of odd or out of place, I think it works to this album's benefit, honestly, because it really just gives Joba a lot of time to reflect, talk about what he wants to say, and considering that his arc is the emotional core here of this record, it makes sense for him to be on the majority of the tracks here and to deliver some of the most poignant and thematically relevant verses on the entire project. The other members of the group aren't purely reduced to being support, though, on this thing. While Joba is often given the spotlight at many points here on this project, and while his lyrics are oftentimes the most obviously connected to the bigger theme of this record, all the other members of the group oftentimes come on the tracks here on this thing to give their own personal stories and things of that sort. And oftentimes these stories and whatever they're trying to talk about here on the songs oftentimes relate in some sort of way to what Joba talks about in a lot of the verses that he gives here on this thing. It's just another instance of all the members in the group kind of talking about similar ideas on a track, though actually talking about their own experiences at the same time. It's something that they've always done on their previous releases, and something I've always appreciated about their group and their style of lyricism. But here on this project, I feel like there was a little bit of extra care put into making sure that Joba always has the spotlight across most of this record, and that all the other members are kind of, like I said before, they are kind of playing support in a sense, but at the same time, I don't mean that in the way to diminish their contributions to this project, because their contributions are still really great across this thing. And I think the way they decided to lay out this album when it comes to who has vocals at which points on this thing is just really well planned when it comes to making sure the theme of this record comes across as nicely as it does. I think the most prominent examples of this style of lyricism here on this record comes on both of the light tracks on this thing. Both of these songs are very similar structurally, with a verse being delivered by Joba and another one being delivered by Kevin. Joba's verses being some of the most explicit and detailed about his father's passing, talking about his relationship with his father, his relationship with the rest of his family, both currently and in the future, as a result of his father's passing. He's talking about his own mental health here on these tracks, his own suicidal thoughts that he's experienced in the past and that he's detailed on previous Brockhampton songs. It's really deep and personal stuff, and these are just a couple of really fantastic verses overall, some of his best ever, honestly. And while his verses are obviously really fantastic here on this track, I find that Kevin's parts of these songs are also equally interesting, and I especially like how they, relate to Joba's verses on these songs. Because while Joba's talking about the loss of his father on these songs, Kevin's also talking about his relationship with his family on these tracks. Particularly, he's talking about his relationship with his mother, a relationship that he's, expressed as being somewhat strained in the past on previous songs of his own and on previous Brockhampton tracks. Mostly, because of his own sexuality and that being a point of conflict in their relationship. But here on this record, he's talking at various points, especially on these couple of light tracks, about how that relationship has gotten somewhat better recently. And while he is in a bit of a better place with his mother here on these couple of tracks, he does also express some points where it seems like the relationship isn't completely healed. For example, on the first light track, he's talking about how he still has trouble admitting who he's in love with to his mother. On the second track, he's talking about how his mother still, votes for whoever keeps Jesus in the conversation. There's still obviously a bit of a divide between the two in some regards, but they are still getting better. And I just find these couple of tracks really interesting from a lyrical standpoint, because on the one hand, you have Joba, who is obviously going through the loss of someone in his family, and on the other hand, you have Kevin, who is in a sense gaining somebody back into his family, I guess you could say. But at the same time, both musicians here on this track have some very conflicting feelings going on that they're trying to work through when it comes to either losing or gaining somebody in their given case. I just find these couple of tracks and how they lay out the lyrics to be really genius. While I think both the light tracks are the most obvious example of this style of lyricism here on this project, it's not the only instance of it by any means. In fact, most of the songs here on the project have this going for them to some extent. I think Don't Shoot Up the Party is another pretty obvious example of it. Here on this track, various members of the group are talking about a variety of different issues ranging from racism, homophobia, and of course suicide in the case of Joba's verse here. And it becomes kind of apparent as you listen to the track that the party in question that they're talking about is probably meant to be a reference to life itself, and they're kind of talking about how these issues often get in the way of life, in fact lead to the end of life, hence the shooting up of the party. And of course Joba's verse here is probably the most blatant with this, with of course suicide quite literally being the ending of your own life. It's very on the nose, but I think it works well in the context of the track, especially as like the last verse here on the song, especially how it ends with the gunshot sounds before fading into the outro of the track. It's just another really fantastic moment on this project lyrically. While I really love Joba's lyricism across this whole project, again, I don't want to undersell the contributions that the other group members bring to this project in their lyrics, because all of them, whether they're talking about political issues, social issues, their own personal lives, they really bring their A game to everything here on this project, and their fantastic lyricism is a big part of why this project is as great as it is. It's not just Joba, despite the fact that he's clearly the focus here on this project. Aside from the lyrics, all the performances that the group members bring to this project are really fantastic as well. All the rapping and singing on this project is really excellent, all up to the same level of high quality that I've come to know and expect from Brockhampton at this point in their career. And the chemistry between all the group members on this project is equally as great as it was on previous releases. Some songs on this thing, like Windows and I'll Take You On, for example, are just some really fine examples of this fantastic chemistry in action. Windows is this lengthy posse cut where really every member of the group is given their own time to shine, and not even just every member of the group. There's also a couple featured artists on this thing, So Gone So Flexy and Ryan Beatty, who all have their moments to shine on this thing as well. And it's just one of those songs that maybe could feel a bit overlong if all the members weren't as tight, and just the chemistry wasn't as fantastic as it actually is here on this song. But fortunately, the chemistry here is really great. All the performances are excellent too, and it just makes for one of Brockhampton's best tracks to date. And I'll Take You On is another great moment on this project too. Unlike Windows, which is this lengthy rap cut, I'll Take You On is this more warm, lush R&B tinged track that sees various members of the group singing and harmonizing together, trading off verses in a very smooth fashion. One of those tracks that just couldn't really be as great as it is without that fantastic chemistry that Brockhampton is just known for at this point. And fortunately, the chemistry is on full display here, and this is just another excellent song on the project as a result of it. I'd say that all the vocals here on this project are up to the same level of high quality I've come to expect from previous Brockhampton releases, as I said before. But one major difference here on this project compared to any previous Brockhampton album is the addition of group member Jabari Manwa's vocals here on this thing. Previously, with the exception of one of those tracks they dropped last year, he had only done production for the group, but here on this project he steps up to be a full-time vocalist as well. And I really like the addition of his voice here on this project. I think it blends in nicely with the sound of the group. He still does have a very distinct voice though compared to everyone else too, and I think he does a really good job both with rapping and singing here on this thing, whether it be the really smooth verse that he delivers on Bankroll or some of the really catchy hooks he has on tracks like Windows or Old News, for example. He just has a good amount of variety to what he can do here on this thing, vocally speaking. And I think there's a lot to his voice that just works well with the core Brockhampton sound. And if anything, I'm a little disappointed that his voice wasn't used a little bit more here on this project. But fortunately, that is a very minor problem, and one that I guess is a good thing overall, because it means I was happy with his vocals and what they added to this project. So yeah, that was a cool addition to this thing, and I'm excited to see what they do with him going forward and his vocals on Brockhampton's next album. The production here on this album is also consistently great too, and as I said before, it offers a good amount of variety to this project as well. You'll have your more abstract, kind of off-kilter instrumentals on tracks like the opener Buzz Cut, for example. You'll have maybe a more soulful tinged track like When I Ball that comes later on in the track list. The soulful sound of this track almost invokes a bit of a nostalgic feel to it, which I think works quite nicely with the lyrics here of this track, given that the song lyrically sees various group members reflecting on their early years. It's just a really perfect match in that regard. As I said before, you do have some poppier and more R&B driven moments on this thing, like I'll Take You On, for example. And then you have a couple of more guitar driven tracks on this thing too, most notably the first light track, as well as the song What's the Occasion. Especially towards the ends of these songs, you have a bit of a build up with the guitars, and I think it allows for the latter half of the light part one, as well as the outro of What's the Occasion, to have this big emotional feel to it that otherwise it wouldn't have. And again, it's a bit of an interesting twist and addition to Brockhampton's sound, unlike anything that they've done before, really. But I think the guitars added into these tracks worked really nicely within the context of these songs that they happen to appear on. So overall, I really enjoyed the vast majority of what Roadrunner had to offer, though as I said towards the start of this review, I did have a few problems with this record. None of them particularly major or anything like that, but some of them did happen to bother me somewhat on occasion while listening to this thing. The first of those somewhat sizable complaints happens to be that the first 4 songs on this thing, while being enjoyable songs in their own right, feel kind of out of place thematically when compared to the rest of the record. It kind of feels like the core theme of the record doesn't really come into the full picture of this project until you get to like the 5th track or so, which is the light part 1. The first 4 songs here, while being really creative and fun in their own ways, just don't really seem to fit in all that much thematically. I mean, Kevin references his relationship with his mother on the opener Buzz Cut, and some of Joba's lyrics towards the very end of the track feel somewhat related to some of the other themes on the record. But aside from that, these first 4 songs, I couldn't really pick out much that was super specifically related to the bigger picture of what the record was really trying to say. I'm not sure if it's because some of the tracks towards the start of this thing, like Bankroll and Chain On, were in the works before Joba's father's passing, or maybe the group just wanted to put some fun tracks towards the start of this thing to give people something fun to listen to before diving into the more emotionally heavy stuff that comes later on. But yeah, it does lead to the start of this thing feeling kind of odd in the greater scope of this project, at least from a thematic standpoint. Again, I think the sound of these tracks is really great. They're all fun, enjoyable songs in their own right. They're not unpleasant to listen to by any means. It's just when looking at the bigger picture of this record, especially when it comes to the lyrics and the themes, I can't help but notice that they feel maybe a little bit out of place, and maybe having these tracks spread out a bit more evenly throughout the rest of the album's track list could have helped avoid this problem, but again, it's not a particularly big one. My other somewhat sizable complaint with the project has to do with some of the features here on this thing. Now overall, I think the majority of the features here on this project are good, if not great. I mean, honestly, with the exception of A$AP Rocky's feature on Count On Me, which I thought was kind of mediocre, and Charlie Wilson being kind of underused on I'll Take You On, I felt like most of the features on this thing were really enjoyable, and I felt like the chemistry that they had with the core members of the group was really solid as well. I don't really have many complaints with the features when it comes to the actual performances that they give themselves, but one consequence of having as many features as this record does have on a project with a theme like this is that oftentimes it kind of seems like the featured artists don't really have much to add to the core concept of the record when it comes to talking about the themes and things like that, which I guess does make sense because obviously the passing of Joba's father isn't going to have the same impact on these featured artists that it had on him as well as his close friends and the rest of the group. It just, obviously these people are not going to be affected in the very same way. Obviously they're probably able to understand what the group is going through, relate to it on some level, but obviously they're not affected in the exact same way. I can't expect them to be affected in the exact same way. That doesn't really make much sense, but it does just overall seem like an odd choice to have as many features as this project does given the concept of the project, because while all the performances, as I said before, are really solid for the most part, oftentimes every feature here on this thing does feel kind of like a diversion from some of the more focused moments on the record. Again, it's not that big of an issue because the performances are as good as they are, and because the chemistry between the featured artist and the core artist here on the record are as great as they are too. But yeah, overall, I feel like maybe a few less features here on this thing could have, worked to this album's benefit, just from a thematic standpoint again. And I also find it kind of cool here on this record how Brockhampton were willing to get both some big name artists that I'm sure fans have wanted to see the group collaborate with for a very long time, and smaller artists too to appear on this project. It seems like the group was focused on giving fans some long desired dream collaborations on some songs here, but on other tracks they were more willing to prop up some smaller artists that they happen to like. Yeah, well, overall I just found it to be kind of a cool thing that they decided to do here on this project, and I gotta respect that. So overall, I found myself really enjoying Roadrunner through and through. It is a record that does have a few problems, as I explained before, but honestly these problems aren't that big of a deal in the grander scheme of the record because, every track on this thing is still really enjoyable, and I'm definitely going to be returning to this record throughout the rest of this year and just going forward more generally speaking, because all the performances on this record are really great, all the instrumentals are really solid, most of the features are really enjoyable as well, and a lot of the lyrics and themes explored here on this thing are also really interesting too. I'm quite excited to see where these guys decide to go on what's going to be their 7th and supposedly last studio release. I'm interested to see if they expand on some of the ideas here on this record, or if they decide to just move in a completely different direction altogether. Regardless, I'm looking forward to it, and if you haven't heard Roadrunner yet, you should definitely change that because it's a really enjoyable record. But yeah, that sums up all my thoughts on this project. Feel free to drop your own thoughts on this project in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like more album reviews, countdown lists, discussion videos, things of that sort. Again, thank you guys for watching this video, and stay golden.